The world of geopolitics is complex. It encapsulates foreign policy, defense, trade, and culture. These can have ripples that can be felt all around the planet.
With that, we welcome you to The Global Detail, a podcast where we go beyond borders and behind the headlines to stories that impact the world.
Our goal is to peel the onion and explore the various diverse layers through riveting interviews with experts and stalwarts. I'm Akshobh Giridharadas.
And co-piloting this journey, I'm Brendan Duke. Let's get into it. In September of 2016, a group of Pakistani militants from the terror group Jaish-e-Mohammed attacked an Indian military base in Uri, Kashmir. 10 days later, the Indian Army sent its elite troops across the line of control into Pakistani-administered Kashmir to conduct surgical strikes on the terror camps. They suffered 0 casualties and avenged the deaths of the 19 Indian soldiers who died in the prior attack. The man in charge of this mission was Lieutenant General Deependra Singh Hooda, a highly decorated veteran and former general officer commanding-in-chief of the Indian Army's Northern Command. These surgical strikes made the general a household name in India. His experience has made him an authority on India's military and strategic affairs, having served along the northern and eastern fronts of India with an ever-turbulent Pakistan to the northwest and to the east, a China that continues to rise on the world stage. The general is also an expert on the much-debated subject of Kashmir, from its security, its politics, and its people. After retiring from the Army, the general continued to lend his experience to multiple NGOs and educational groups to help the next generation of Indian academics and policymakers forge India's future. Akshobh Giridharadas spoke with General D.S. Hooda about his military experience, his post-retirement endeavors, and his assessment of the future of India's foreign policy.
General, if I want to take you back in time, of course, over 40 years of military service, but in some ways I don't know if they say save the best for last, but in 2016, just when you were nearing retirement, you had many operations, but surgical strikes was, of course, one of the operations where you were interviewed and became a household name. I remember you mentioning at that time that battles are won and lost in the mind of commanders. As someone in charge of the Indian Army Command in Kashmir at that time, Northern Command, and leading the surgical strike, what was the mental preparedness for that?
So, Akshobh, let me step back from the surgical strikes 10 days prior to when the surgical strikes happened. And when the Uri garrison was attacked, because that was a real trigger for the surgical strikes. And that day was not good, Akshobh. We had 19 soldiers killed in a terrorist attack at our Uri garrison. At that time, it was the maximum casualties in a single operation that had happened in the last 20 years. And we were sort of, honestly struggling with how to come out with a response, how to come out of this setback. And that's when we said, look, we'll do the postmortems later. We will look at why this has happened later. But let's just now start planning to give a strong message across the border that, this cannot go sort of unchallenged, or we need to do something. And so the 10 days, that followed the Uri attack went into the planning and refining and preparation for the surgical strike. What was going through your mind, Akshobh, was honestly that this is an operation that not only has a significance for the military, but also in some ways a national significance. Because we knew that, the country is going to come out and say, this is exactly how we responded. And so we were very conscious that in some ways failure was not an option, and that you had to succeed. So while, of course, you're worried about soldiers going across the line of control and casualties and what would happen in case some setback happens. But I think at the back of the mind also was that we need to succeed for the nation to sort of get charged up.
General, you mentioned those incidents that led to it because 2016 was, a boiling pressure cooker situation in Kashmir. You had the Pathankot air base attack, you had the Uri attacks, Buran Wani, and it just everything was just simmering. And General, you've seen loss of life in your many years of military service. But if I recall correctly, soldiers of Bihar regiments carrying their coffins, and there was a sense of anger in the country that this keeps happening. In the sense that India has been multiple, long before 9/11, been suffering terror attacks, and even post 9/11, of course, Bombay Parliament attacks, you've had Bombay blasts. Was there a sense that India always had a pusillanimous foreign policy despite a very strong military, and something had to change?
Absolutely, Akshobh. I think that realization was there, and to be fair, to the current government and the current political leadership, I think they were much more willing to take risks, much more willing to send out a sort of a strong signal. I'm conscious, what you're saying, the sense of anger among the people. Akshobh, we were under pressure as the army. People were asking us, you were supposed to defend the country. You cannot even defend your garrisons. That's the kind of pressure that, as commanders, you are under. And so, as I said, we had to respond, and we had to respond strongly, and we had to respond well. And after it happened, I think it did send a signal to Pakistan that, look, you can carry out sort of terrorist activities, but it will come at a cost. So, which is what you're saying, that, people say Mumbai happened and nothing, there was no real response to that. There are many sort of ideas about that, and some people who were there in authority at that time feel that that was the best response. But anyway, leaving that aside, the signal that was sent out was there will be a cost to what you do. And I think not only the surgical strikes, I think even the Pulwama and the Balakot airstrikes sort of showed that.
I did want to ask you about that, General, even though I know it happened a little much after surgical strikes. And on record, you mentioned that you hit both sides of Peer Panjal, and I'm cognizant of classified and things that you can't speak on record. But in some ways, and forgive me if it's hyperbole, but for a lot of people in India, it was our Zero Dark 30 moment, whereas going across, at least of this scale publicly, going across the border, was sending India's best and brightest ops. What can you tell us that's publicly available of the preparation, of the risk? And while the border seemed very fortified, we've seen infiltration from the Pakistan side, but being able to send legitimate soldiers of India's elite across the border to hit particular targets, what was the preparedness like? And of course, there's no operation like this comes at risk, and assessing that risk before you're given the go ahead and you executed the mission.
So, Akshobh, the broad political directions to us were, and these are important when political directions are given, was that we need to send a strong message to Pakistan. And therefore, it cannot be, a one-off operation. To be fair, it's not as if the Indian Army has been sitting on its own side of the line of control and never done anything across. So there have been operations also in the past. But they said we want to send a large and a strong message, which meant we had to do, as you said, multiple operations, both sides of Punjab's, Jammu region, we did in Kashmir region, multiple operations on the same night. So the planning was very complex. The scale of the operations was much larger than what had been attempted in the past. So we hit, and the targets were Pakistan terrorist camps. As you know, the India-Pakistan border is possibly the most heavily fortified border in the world. I mean, you could compare it maybe to North Korea or something, but otherwise it's very heavily fortified. We had to go across the line of Pakistani defenses, go to camps, terrorist camps which are in the rear, hit them, and we were conscious that all this could be carried out in surprise. But once you hit the camps and the firing happens, then everyone is alert. And then you had to cross the same line of Pakistani defenses to come back into our own area. So it was a risky operation. But Akshobh, the special forces troops were supremely confident. I mean, they'd done their recce, they'd done all the detailed planning. In fact, a number of them had already gone across line of control prior to the operation, scoped out the whole area, scoped out the territory. We knew exactly how many people are there in each camp, what the routine of the sentries is. And so we were able to sort of, execute it, I would say, quite successfully. I mean, when you carry out an operation like this, you're conscious that you could have casualties, you could have complications. Fortunately, everything just went exactly as we planned.
And of course, as many presidents and U.S. Army commands always said, the toughest decision is sending your men into battle, and I'm sure you had to do that. Since you said the borders are more fortified, not just fortified, but two nuclear armed rivals in India and Pakistan, and having seen Kargil and Operation Vijay a little over 2 decades ago in '99, that was the first time India and Pakistan went to conflict when both were nuclearized. Given something like this, it's so easy to precipitate into something much bigger. And India acknowledging surgical strikes, what anticipation or retaliation, what were you anticipating from the Pakistani side, especially when the Indian DGMO spoke to his Pakistani counterpart? And you mentioned there was panic on the Pakistani side. And given how the Pakistan military is so codified in the national identity of the Pakistani psyche, something like this is embarrassing for Pakistan military national security. So would you expect them to take it as lying down as they did?
So Akshobh, we had planned. We had planned for retaliation. We had planned that they could do something because as you said, for Pakistan, accepting that India has come and done something in their territory is like a, should I say, egg on the face. If you recall, when we carried out a cross-border operation in Manipur in 2015, if you look at Pakistan military statements, I think the DGISI is on record saying, look, if the Indian Army thinks they can do something similar on the Pakistan border, they are sadly mistaken. The fact is that we did it. We did it. So we were planning and prepared for a retaliation. But the minute the Pakistani statement came out saying, look, nothing has happened, we knew that they are not going to acknowledge it and that they were completely shocked and unprepared for this. And therefore, the question of retaliation sort of didn't occur. I mean, the minute you say, look, nothing has happened, so where is the question of me retaliating? So at that stage, we were sort of conscious. We didn't put our guard down. We were conscious that possibly you're going to see nothing from the Pakistan army side.
Speaking of retaliation, years later, I think we'd already retired from service. We had Balakot as well in retaliation. And then, of course, a dogfight between the Indian Air Forces and the Pakistani Air Force. And of course, Abhinandan Varthaman's jet got shot over and he was caught by the Pakistan Army. And that became one of the very high profile, when an Indian POW was taken over, not since, I think, Nachiketa, since Kargil, if I'm not mistaken. And if you were to assess from what happened in surgical strikes to Balakot, and I understand different armed services got involved, but how would you look at that as a failure in as compared to surgical strikes? Because this led to an escalation of tensions between India and Pakistan. And even today, sadly, Abhinandan is doomed in Pakistan, and there's this whole handover ceremony that the Pakistanis did across the Wagah border. How do you see the two different operations?
Look, I think both India and Pakistan would have learned their lessons from the surgical strikes, and there was criticism in Pakistan, although they said nothing has happened, but there was enough evidence to show that uh, Indian troops have crossed the border and have carried out a cross-border operation. So I think from Pakistan's perspective, not retaliating to uh, the Balakot airstrike would have been, I think, nationally, politically sort of not acceptable to their people. So they had to do something, and therefore they launched a counter strike after we did Balakot. Is it escalatory? It certainly is, Akshobh. There is a likelihood of escalation every time you use military power, particularly into somebody else's territory. Fortunately, both countries stepped back from that escalation, and things got resolved, and Abhinandan got returned. Are there lessons again for both countries to learn from this? I think there are, that things can escalate. But I also see, Akshobh, and a lot of people ask me this question about, here are two nuclear armed countries, and escalation happens, nuclear weapons could be utilized. But if you look at the history of India, Pakistan, there has been some levels of restraint at the national level. I mean, look at the Kargil war; it wasn't escalated. We've been having constant, firing at the line of control. That doesn't escalate. So I think both countries also understand that escalation carries huge costs.
General, you joined the Indian Armed Services in 1976, shortly after 1971, the liberation of East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, 90,000 POWs on the Pakistani side. And since then, you've seen Operation Meghdoot with Siachen, you've seen Kargil War and several counterinsurgency operations. Um, as we passed 75 years last year, celebrated 75 years of Indian and Pakistani independence, but 75 years of, as Steve Cohen says, we're shooting for a century, India, Pakistan. It's always been 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. And when you go back, you see Prime Minister Vajpayee took the bus into Lahore, stood at Minari, Pakistan, rewarded the Kargil War, had General Musharraf come over, and then had the Parliament attacks. And even with Prime Minister Modi, there was invitation to Prime Minister Sharif. And then, as you know, when you were in charge, Uri Pathankot. And it just seems like, is it always going to be not war, but not peace either? It won't ever be a Cold War. It'll be what hot peace is right now. Is that forever? Forever is a strong word, but there seems to be no seismic shift in India, Pakistan, or approach more.
Yeah, so if you look at the past history, if you look at the current times, frankly, diplomacy is dead. I mean, there are no high commissioners of the two countries, which are here in the Pakistan or the Indian embassy. Political engagement, diplomatic engagement has absolutely not taken place, and so the guns were doing all the talking at the line of control. Hopefully, I think, Akshobh, I don't want to sound as if it's somebody's fault, but it was always Pakistan Army's view that India is an existential threat to them. India did not look at Pakistan that way. But they also, always felt that here is this country which is larger than us, and which doesn't want, Pakistan to sort of exist as a country, harking back to partition days. Some of that, I think, could change because of sort of mess that Pakistan finds itself in, a political crisis, an economic crisis, an internal security crisis. And maybe that will help them sort of reassess, and see what their challenges are instead of just focusing on India, and sort of seeing how they can meet their own problems and their own issues. I am also of the view that two neighbors must talk to each other. I mean, there is a fact of geography, and so if you can talk to each other, you can lay down and set your red lines and say these are my red lines, and so they should not be crossed. But I think it's always good that we have some conversation going with the Pakistanis.
General, and while we spoke a lot about Indian Army, where you worn your uniform and badge and cap proudly, the Pakistani Army psyche, and this is now bordering on cliche when we say this, is most states have an army in Pakistan, the army has a state, and as you rightly said, given it was born out of a bloody partition, and the psyche of having military coups, and where the general has more heft than any prime minister, no civilian prime minister has finished 5 years. Still today, that remains the case. Bangladesh never had the same story, even though it was born out of a war as well. It focused on development and not like a castle security state. And we've had Ambassador Haqqani on the same show, and now with Afghanistan in the news, or a little out of the news, the notion of Afghanistan was also strategic depth. If India invades and Pakistan being so narrow, is the psyche still going to be the same, given for many years it was still a publicly US ally, still is a US ally? The threat from India, you see that diminishing now? You mentioned some of the economic concerns, but in your understanding and study of Pakistan, of the ISI, of the NSA level talks, of the military, do you see that waning a little bit, given economic prioritization of the country?
I don't know, Akshobh. So, for example, if you look at Kashmir, I mean, Pakistan keeps harping on Kashmir, irrespective of which political leadership is there. They say like this is a completely sort of core issue. If you recall the floods that happened in Pakistan, I mean, after that, the easiest country to import food grain was from India, but they said, no, we will not take anything from India.
Mm.
I think this whole psyche needs to change. How will it change? And it'll only change if they find that keeping the country together, ensuring development in the country, needs us to focus on the more essential aspects. As far as Afghanistan is concerned, I think the notions about Afghanistan being almost a proxy state of Pakistan, that whole idea of strategic depth, I think is now out of the window, because the Taliban have told them very clearly that we have our own independent thinking and that we cannot just, accept what you say. And sorry. And you see, I mean, the problem that they're having with the TTP and Afghanistan.
I do want to come to Afghanistan as well, because I recently heard Ambassador Raz and Ambassador Haqqani discuss this, but I wanted to ask you, because Kashmir, I mean, it's the elephant in the room every time with India and Pakistan, and the notion that Pakistan said that all unfinished business of partition, and you've served in Kashmir, you've seen it militarily, you've seen it from a human rights perspective, you've seen it politically. Also, in the High Commissioner's bit, India and Pakistan relations have ebbed and flowed and hit nadir many times. But if I recall correctly, since Article 370, this is the first time that India did something for Pakistan to be offended and pull back. Normally, we've pulled away High Commissioner after 71 war, or after the Parliament attacks, but never in such a way. And with no High Commissioner in sight, it looks like there's going to be no rapprochement. Pakistan politically is in a very complex jigsaw trying to figure out its own self. The reason I wanted to ask about Kashmir is the secret that I picked up is from Khurshid Kasuri's book, former Pakistan foreign minister, where he said, in neither a hawk nor a dove. He's like, our part of Kashmir we have and you can't get it. Your part of Kashmir you have and we can't get it. So has he touched on something, the Italian concept of irredentism? Because irrespective of what you hear in Indian news channels, there's no way to get POK, Pakistan occupied Kashmir without without militarily, and that's very costly. And there's no way for Pakistan to rest Indian control. Is there a way to look past this and move on or formalize the LOC? I know it's a very hefty topic and neither side will agree, but it just stalemate.
See, Akshobh, so I think the things that you're saying were what were being discussed between Vajpayee, General Musharraf, and then Manmohan Singh and Musharraf on soft borders at the line of control. We had started a bus service where both sides could visit without the requirement of passports and visas, etc. Trade had started across the line of control. We were discussing confidence building measures along the line of control. That was a sort of a good concept that could have led to some kind of agreement between the two sides. Unfortunately, the Mumbai attack actually put everything on that issue on the back burner. On the current situation in Jammu and Kashmir on Article 370, look, we could argue whether Article 370 application was the removal of Article 372 or the abrogation of Article 370 was done constitutionally, was not done constitutionally. This is a matter for, it's there with the Supreme Court and it's for them to decide. The government has taken a decision. My view of Akshobh is this. There is a situation of Kashmir between India and Pakistan. That situation involves borders. Where do the boundaries lie? Does Jammu and Kashmir as a state belong to India? Does it belong to Pakistan? I mean, there are different viewpoints. This is a matter of frontiers and borders. What is the internal constitutional arrangement within Jammu and Kashmir? Really is not for Pakistan to comment on. Just as we don't comment on what is the constitutional provisions in Pakistani occupied Kashmir or in Pakistan. These are internal matters of the state. So really for Pakistan to keep harping on Article 370, breakup of the states into union territories is really, let me put it bluntly, none of their business. So what we can discuss is, as you said, what to do with the line of control. How should we manage that? But I mean, how should India constitutionally govern a state? Really, that's really not a matter of concern for Pakistan. And really, by harping on it, I mean, really, they're not going to get anywhere.
That's a very pertinent point because it seemed very ironic because Pakistani commentary and Imran Khan, when he was prime minister, would mention things like a unilateral annexation of Kashmir, which is a fallacy because Article 370 is an article in the Indian Constitution of sovereign state, and Pakistan keeps harping on the UN resolution, but those are defunct given the first criteria was not fulfilled of Pakistan withdrawing. So it just seems like a bit of a legal imbroglio that Pakistan has not fulfilled. But from your time in Kashmir, apart from the situation in Pakistan, you've seen it politically, the other stakeholders of various political parties, be it the Abdullah parties or the Muftis or the Hurriyads and the people of Kashmir as well. How would you take a step back, and now that you're no longer with the Indian military, paint Kashmir on a canvas today? Because it's more complicated than just India and Pakistan fighting over it, not just Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's a little more complex than that.
Sure, Akshobh. So there is an external aspect to Jammu and Kashmir, which is what I talked about between India and Pakistan. There is also an internal aspect, and I think we should not ignore it to say, look, everything is fine in Jammu and Kashmir. There are issues. There is angst. There is frustration. There are identity issues, both in Kashmir, in Jammu, in Ladakh. it's a state where you haven't had held elections now since, I don't know, many years. So therefore, there are political issues. There are issues of radicalization that is happening in the state. There are issues, as I said, about frustration of people, uh, about their sort of political representation. There is an alienation that is happening. So let us not ignore those issues also. And so those need to be addressed by the Indian state. That look, we care for you. You are our people, and we will address your genuine concerns. And when I'm saying genuine concern, you need to address concerns of every section of the population, whether it's the Kashmiris, whether it's the Hindus of Jammu, whether it's the Kashmiri Pandits, who have a deep sense of angst that is within them for what has happened to them. So I think a little bit of healing touch is required. So yes, deal with terrorism, deal with terrorists who are there, but I think the outreach to the people is something, if I can say, needs to be improved on.
We often forget that, General, apart from Indian Army and external duties, there's also a lot of internal duties as well. And from your background, not just with Pakistan and China, which I'll get to, you also did a lot of counterinsurgency operations internally in the sensitive areas in Northeast, Assam, Nagaland, Manipur. Talk us about some of the restive areas that people often forget that India has in Northeast, because Kashmir, as we know, gets dominated because international discourse in Pakistan. But some of the other sensitive areas that the Indian Army has had to, and your operations have had to, within India as well.
Yeah, so actually, if you look at the Army's engagement in internal security duties, I would say it's fairly large in the northeastern states, and predates Kashmir by many, many decades. So the first employment of the Army in Nagaland was actually in the 1950s. And then Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, Tripura, Assam. So these are also areas where the Army is engaged. Although I'm happy to note that as things have got better, I think the government has taken a decision that we need to reduce the presence of the Army in these areas, and particularly when sort of the China threat looms large, that we need to slowly give these internal security duties to the central police forces and remove the Army. But there is still Assam Rifles and Army presence is there in these Northeast states.
And speaking of Northeast, of course, very close to the China border, and you've served also on areas close to China border. And the difference, obviously, we say LOC with Pakistan and LAC, and this came to international attention in 2020 with the Galwan attacks, because there was all this economic notions of India and China working together. When Prime Minister Modi came in 2014, during his days as chief minister, he believed in working with China. In some ways, it was the way Vajpayee wanted peace with Pakistan. Prime Minister Modi initiated economic cooperation with China. He made visits when he was chief minister and went to Wuhan to see Xi Jinping, and had Xi over even after Doklam as well. And then, but in 2020, that just caught everyone by storm, because we used to bullets being fired across and insurgency from the Pakistan side, despite disagreements with China, and we've had a Natula Pass, but we never saw the kind of hooliganism that we saw reported from the PLA, brickbats, and an Indian Army major being killed and 20 soldiers dying, and they just caught it by storm. And since then, Sino-India ties have reduced, and I'll get to the Quad, and India seems to have more active participation in Quad and other, which are not really publicly against China, but it still has a sense of China containment.
So, Akshobh, in some ways, actually, 2020 is a defining moment in India-China relations. So, as you mentioned, prior to 2020, the sense always was, yes, there is an undefined border. Yes, the LAC is not sort of delineated or demarcated. There are transgressions that happen from both sides as people patrol their claimed areas. But the sense was that we could handle China politically and diplomatically. That it would actually not come to military actions along the LAC. I think 2020 changed that. And I'm saying this view was not so much among the military leadership as among the political leadership. The military leadership always said China is going to be the bigger challenge as we go forward. So let's not focus so much on Pakistan, but let's focus more on China. Which is why actually you find since 2005-06 sanctions for greater infrastructure development. You find raisings of 2 mountain divisions, 1 mountain strike corps. This all happened up to about 2012-13. Because the military always pushed that this is a bigger sort of challenge. But as I said, there was a feeling that we could handle it politically, diplomatically. Our economic engagement is so good that it will prevent the two countries from, taking any military action. 2020 has changed that. After that, ties have gone downhill. The situation along the LAC Akshobh is tense because whatever confidence building measures that we had between India and China, literally all of them have broken down. And so there is a much larger deployment of troops. There is more aggressive action on both sides. There is mutual suspicion. And so, this really makes for a tense border.
General, from your 40 years in military service, apart from seeing militarization, you've also seen a change of leadership. And everyone talks about China. It's like the elephant in the room is a dragon. Given India shares one of the largest borders in China, the threat is very real for India. In my assessment and noticing is there was, since Xi Jinping came a little over a decade ago in 2012, a lot of times China had the Deng Xiaoping credo of hide your strength and bide your time. There's very Sun Tzu, appear strong when you're weak and weak when you're strong. And Xi Jinping seems to have just moved away from that school of thought. It seems to be iron hand, weather glove, and you've seen that with militarization on the Indian border, militarization of the South China Sea, tensions with Japan, with Senkaku Daiju Islands, and so it's a wolf warrior diplomacy. Is this a tectonic shift that you've seen with Xi Jinping as compared to when Hu Jintao and other Chinese leaders were in charge?
There is, Akshobh, and you mentioned what's happening, South China Sea, East China Sea, what China has been doing for its sort of territorial and maritime claims, its aggressiveness in diplomacy. Let me just take you back to the India-China border and give you some examples. So the first time when there was like a major standoff where Chinese troops had come in and sort of permanently occupied areas in our claimed areas was 2013 at Depsang. Next year, 2014, and I was the army commander at that time, the Chinese attempted a very large incursion into Chumar, again in Ladakh, at a time when Xi Jinping was visiting India. And somebody said, look, maybe the military has done this, without his know-how. And I said, this is like just impossible that the president is visiting another country and his military is doing something behind his back. Just wasn't possible. So 2013, you saw that. 2014, 2017 was Doklam. And slowly we were finding much greater aggression by China along the line of actual control. I am convinced the change in leadership and Xi Jinping, from the time that he has come, you're finding things have become more aggressive, and this bide your time is actually now gone.
Xi Jinping visiting India and PLA incursion is very redolent of when Prime Minister Vajpayee was visiting Lahore and Musharraf was planning Kargil. It just seems more and more on the Quad. We remember in 2004, the Quad started for Indian Ocean relief. In 2009, Australia was a little reluctant partner because back then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd was now becoming Australian ambassador to the US, fluent Mandarin speaker, perhaps a little hesitant, and Australia was dependent on China's economic boom for its commodities. The world was going through a recession. Beijing had Olympics. Beijing announced itself on the world stage in grand spectacle. But now you've seen with militarization of the South China Sea, India's umbrage with China on Galwan, China, Japan, East China Seas, Australia tensions with China post the virus. And of course, we'll be all day if we talk about Washington, Beijing tensions. There is now, even the Quad says not an Asian NATO, but there's still an element of China containment. It seems the elephant in the room is a dragon because everything the Quad puts out is hinted at China, free and open Indo-Pacific, rules-based international order, for democracies. Is it a China containment strategy, even though publicly there's a lot of economic incentives? But do you see that?
Absolutely. Although Quad has not announced itself as some grouping or a military grouping which is aimed at countering China, but what you are seeing is, what are the four countries, Japan, Australia, US, and India? What are their big strategic concerns today in the Indo-Pacific region? And the big concern is straight away China. And if you look at what has happened post-2020, the Quad engagement has become much stronger. Leaders are meeting each other. There's much greater engagement that is taking place. Areas of common interest are being fleshed out. I think in many ways, the Chinese thought 2020 would get them to send a signal to India that, look, we don't like your growing sort of close partnership with the United States. We don't like what you are saying, what you're doing. The impact and the effect has just been the opposite. It's like actually now without, although India keeps saying strategic autonomy, and it does use strategic autonomy and its own national interest keeps those foremost. But I think there is also a realization that as China grows more and more powerful, any single country will not be able to challenge its rise. And therefore, there is a need to get together partners to come to a common understanding as to how to check China's aggressiveness.
Also on what we call Middle East Quad, or now I2U2. The name is not very original, but India, Israel, UAE, US, the Abraham Accords, and now codify Israel and GCC country nations. And is there also a sense of China's growing Middle East influence? We know China and Iran have got a 25-year strategic partnership. Chabahar Port, which India was looking for, as opposed to Gwadar, is now very much China hands. And the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, runs along a lot of these Central Asian nations and the Middle East. Do you see that, closer military cooperation with Israel that India has, but with drone technology and working with UAE for energy economy, is that also China containment in those regions? Because little literature on I2U2 as compared to the Quad.
So I wouldn't say China's containment, but India as a growing power needs to find its influence in the region, and there are close sort of economic ties. There are people-to-people contacts that happen with Israel. There are very close sort of military ties that have developed over the years. Here, I would say, I think the Chinese presence and their growing influence is also a result of a feeling that, look, America is stepping back from the Middle East. And I think to some extent that has increased China's influence. Look at Saudi Arabia has been a traditional strong partner of the United States, but today if they feel that they need to go with China, it's probably because they feel, look, maybe America, thinks our energy supplies are done, our Middle East interests are no longer as strong as they were in the past. I think this is where possibly America needs to also step in a bit and see. And I don't envy America. They have their hands full now with Ukraine and with the Indo-Pacific and China.
You gave that answer right there because the United States and Washington is preoccupied with Ukraine, the Indo-Pacific theater. There's a bit of a vacuum in the Middle East. For so long, U.S. and Saudi Arabia were lockstep. The petrodollar, the energy economy, the epitome of GCC was Saudi Arabia and a Sunni client and Iran containment as well that worked well for the United States, given they both share umbrage with Iran. But given is China's strategy, especially with the BRI, it's very nebulous. No one really knows how it looks. But if you just think about it from China's perspective for a minute, and wargaming to use an army term, they don't have the historical baggage of Western power. Say in Britain and France, having divided the region, don't have America's history of invasion in Iraq or any of the operations in Lebanon. So China and American aid used to come with caveats of if you have freedom and democracy. I mean, even though that's very debatable, um, China will probably tell Iran or Saudi Arabia, look, we don't care about your ideology of Wahhabism or Ayatollah Shia clericism because we have an ideology that most people don't subscribe. But you need roads, rails, infrastructure. So here's some investment. And of course, in case of South Asia, countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan have fallen to debt trap diplomacy, and it becomes like in the form of attractive ang pao, but it gets the IMF will tell you how dangerous those loans can be. So do you think from China's point of view, and if you're a fledgling small economy, you're like, yeah, why won't I take Chinese investments across the region?
Akshobh, I completely agree with you, which is why the BRI has been, at least in the initial stages, has been a very, very successful venture. I mean, we might say, look, it leads to debt trap, and it hasn't really played out in the manner that it should have. But there are, as you're saying, many countries across Asia, Africa, who have actually bought into the BRI and think it helps them economically. It helps them to, develop as a nation. I'm also not very sure on the BRI. There are different narratives. So there is one sort of Western narrative which says very bad and it's not happening. There is another sort of I've read a number of reports which have said the BRI has actually benefited many countries. So it isn't as if it's only a debt trap issue, but China has invested, and so it has increased its influence in the region. It has put in its money. It has helped in the development. Some cases, yes, there have been major issues, but I think you just cannot write off the BRI. It's been almost like a global venture for them.
Coming to the other global conflict going on, Russia, war, Ukraine. In Washington, D.C., where I reside, as you know, General, there's a lot of umbrage on India's abstentions across various UN platforms. And this notion, and having been part of the Indian military for 4 decades, about India's close militarization, started from erstwhile Soviet Union days, which you're familiar with, to now. Even though India has got a very strong strategic partnership with the United States, there was this belief that India's democratic principles should have aligned in abstaining and talking about Ukraine's sovereignty violated. Do you see it more as one is just the defense relationship India has with the Soviet Union, two, also not trying to get involved in condemnation, and three, honoring USSR's former P5 votes on anything that when Pakistan would use China to bring up Kashmir? Do you see that as historical rewards?
I think Ashok, it's a mix of all these. I mean, India and Russia have had a very close strategic sort of partnership in the past. Also now, so if you see where was the first meeting after 2020, where was the first meeting between the foreign ministers and defense ministers of India and China held? In Moscow. So India also sees Moscow as a partner that can somehow intervene in cases of, if there is some India-China sort of issues. We are partners in the various sort of multilateral forums We have a Russia-India-China forum called the RIC. There is also this huge dependency on military weapons. And so you just cannot shake it off. I mean, you're talking about 60-70% dependency for new equipment, for spares, for upgrades. You just cannot cut it off and say, look, it's gone, and so we will participate in the American sanctions programs. And India is a growing economy, but the people are poor, and so you need energy at whatever least cost you can get it. So I think there are self-interests involved, and just not a matter of closing your eyes and saying, look, democracy means this, and so therefore, this is the path that you need to follow. I think India needs to look at its self-interest, just as all nations do. And I think it's the self-interest that is guiding India's position. For sure, India is not saying what Russia did is right. And the Prime Minister said there's not a need of war, and we need to get, peace needs to come in. But I do not see sort of just an outright condemnation on the grounds that we are a democracy and therefore need to condemn Russia's actions.
The Indian Foreign Ministry and various spokespersons have been very clear that an abstention is not a vote for Russia. And as you rightly said, energy dependence, given the energy security is a vital concern. That brings me to the India-US thing. And a lot of what I work on, a lot of what you've seen, generally in the 70s, in the post-Kissinger-Nixon era, there was still this estrangement. There was a US-Pakistan thing. There was, every time you saw two military dictators who should have been reviled ad nauseum, Afghanistan happened with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that got Zia-ul-Haq, blue-eyed boy in Washington. Same thing with Musharraf post 9/11. And there was a notion that US-India will always, have a strategic partnership, but never this form. And you think since the civil nuclear deal of 2005, to Obama calling India a major strategic defense partner, to now we have things like ISET on critical and emerging technologies. How have you seen that relationship with Washington, given India is not a treaty ally like a Japan, like a Korea, like a Germany, like a France? Is this been this tectonic shift that you saw coming, but perhaps could not see the scale of the way it's grown?
There has been a tremendous growth, in not only in India-US relations, in some ways, the defense partnership between the two countries. So if you actually look, some people say that the improvement in relations was actually Pentagon-led and not led by, the State Department. So if you look at how the cooperation has grown, particularly in the military-to-military cooperation between the two countries, we've had these very poor foundational agreements on logistics, on communications, on sharing of geospatial intelligence. You talked about the major sort of defense partnership that has come in. The U.S. government has amended rules to permit exports of high technology defense equipment to India. In the period 2018 to 2022, U.S. has been the third largest exporter of arms to India. So this partnership has grown. Are there some concerns? Yes, there are. Two different countries, and you would have outlook differently on some issues. So there is still the issue of sanctions. The Karkata issue is still hanging fire over purchase of S-400, the sanctions that have been put on Russian companies, defense companies. From the Indian side, they still feel that really there hasn't been a major technology transfer to India. And that somehow needs to improve. But despite these differences, I think, which are manageable, the partnership today is, much, much stronger than what it was.
I think since the civil nuclear deal, which was an inflection point, because President Bush was still dealing with President Musharraf at that time. And when that happened, and not long ago, you had Clinton sanctions for Pokhran. And I was just thinking about what you said, because if you think about it, we've had since Clinton Vajpayee and the reset since 2022, you had every permutation combination of Democrat, Republican, BJP, Congress to show that the relationship was truly bipartisan. And a lot of it also has the diaspora story, the Indian CEO here, the spelling bee champion, the doctors here, and also strategic partnership. But on the strategic partnership, as you said, we've had LEMOA, we've had the 2+2 dialogues, and now we have Initiative for Critical and Emerging Technologies. And right now, chip sharing and semiconductor autonomous drones and AI. From your time in military service to now, this evolution of machine warfare, this next generation, how do you assess military preparedness, particularly from the Indian Army? And given we talk about India's tech talent, but we always talk about it from the economic sense. But given warfare is evolving, so how do you see the shift and the evolution?
So, Akshobh, with that, technology has always impacted the character of warfare. It's not something that's new. What we are seeing today is the pace at which technology is changing. I mean, just as an aside, I mean, how old is ChatGPT? And now you find so many versions of AI that are coming out. I mean, it completely boggles the mind. So the pace at which technology is changing is actually what is impacting warfare. And to be honest, Akshobh, the Indian military has been slow to start its adoption. We're only very recently set up what we call a cyber agency. So cyber really wasn't looked at in a very holistic manner. Information warfare is still not being looked at in a holistic manner. We are one of the few countries that doesn't even have armed drones, considering that we have such a large military. The adoption on unmanned systems, robotics, is a bit slow. But I think the realization is there now that this needs to change. And again, this is one area I think where the United States can step in and help India, quickly bring in some technology, not only in the civilian field but also in the military field to bring up the capabilities.
Dialogue, Initiative for Critical Emerging Technology at NSA level is perhaps it came through the Quad where both Biden and Modi announced it last time in Tokyo. So do you see that pushing the agenda for critical emerging technology being shared between Washington and Delhi?
So, Akshobh, to be honest, I think the policies are there in place. When I said that we haven't really seen high technology transfer from the US, I think that's where we need to put those policies into practice. And for that, much needs to happen. So you could say, look, the government can only push to some extent. Ultimately, it's the IPR is owned by the private companies. Actually, the private companies have to also come and say, yes, we think it's attractive to invest in India. So somewhere I think that the policies are all in place. How is it that both countries can work together to make it happen on ground is I think crucial.
In terms of, we spoke about the Indian Army. I mean, like the Indian Army as an institution existed in pre-independence eras, inherited a lot of it from the British. In terms of evolution, like all institutions have to change, evolution has to change. From what you've touched on, we've also had recently we've had CDS where we had, one person, like, is it more like trying to take a leaf out of the American playbook of Joint Chiefs, where you have a CDS, or is it trying to unite or perhaps close a military coordination between the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, which were they previously siloed, or do you feel this new coordination is sort of what the Indian Army needs, the Indian military forces need rather?
Akshobh, to be blunt, they were siloed. So there were three strong service chiefs, working in their own silos. There was a level of coordination, but really the jointness that was required, both in terms of structures and in terms of operational, was missing. So I think the government took an excellent step by appointing the Chief of Defence Staff. This is something that was recommended in the Kargil Review Committee after the Kargil War, that we need a Chief of Defence Staff to coordinate the operations of the three services. So it's an absolutely essential requirement, and the restructuring is in process. Planning is going on. I know it takes time to break through structures and break through thinking that has been established among the leadership for many years. But I'm hopeful that they will get there.
That we inherit, which are legacies such as the Indian Army. We've seen that with some of the conversation on the civil services about having lateral entries, closer cooperation with the private sector. Is some of that viable given the sensitivity of the Indian Armed Forces, getting more private sector cooperation, as you touched on with some of the technology, because increasing efficiency from various sources?
Akshobh, is absolutely required. I mean, to think we can in-house develop all the expertise that is required and the kind of expertise that is now needed. And technology is one example. You need to look at artificial intelligence. You need to look at quantum computing. I mean, where are you going to get this expertise in-house and develop it? So there is no option, I think, to take subject matter experts from outside, see how they can be integrated within the army. Don't need to have them serve for 20 years, 30 years, but they can come in for short tenure, 3, 4, 5 years. A lot of guys are very keen to put on the uniform and serve. And so you take their expertise. It just has to be done. I think the whole traditional manning systems of militaries needs to change.
Gracious of your time, and I do want to not keep you too much longer, but if I have my penultimate question, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about Afghanistan, because we saw it post 9/11 when Afghanistan came on the world map, and the Taliban, most people forgot about in the 90s, and even though India experienced Taliban long before 9/11, it's the case of IC-814 hijacking. The very simple question, and we had Afghan experts on the show before, is that the United States spent all this trillions of dollars, money to the exchequer, with U.S. armed forces in Afghanistan, only to replace the Taliban with the Taliban, because you see Afghan citizens here, Afghan women here, and can we really expect Taliban 2.0 to be different from Taliban 1.0, given the ideology they profess? And do you see Pakistan now happy again with Taliban back, because they looked at Afghanistan as a client state for many years? Is that still going to be on the Pakistan-Afghanistan issue?
So I think, Akshobh, the first answer to the question of whether you're going to see a change in ideology, I think, is already out there in front of us. I mean, you've seen the human rights situation. You've seen how women have been kept out of, young girls being kept out of school, women being banned from working with NGOs, the kind of restrictions that have been placed on women. So I don't think there is going to be a change in ideology. The issue also, Akshobh, is because there is this huge humanitarian crisis that is occurring in Afghanistan. Nations are willing to engage with Taliban for the people. There is also a fear among the neighbors of Afghanistan that there could be a spillover of terrorism and instability into our region. And so they're also willing to engage with the Taliban on these issues. And I think Taliban is taking advantage of this. That look, the neighbors and the United Nations and the world will keep engaging with us, irrespective of what we do. And to some extent, that is encouraging them to continue with their ideology. It's a complicated issue. It's not easy. For the UN continues to say, look, we need to keep engaging with them, irrespective of what they're doing. So, on the issue of Pakistan, I think Pakistan is not happy at all with the Taliban. they expected that the Taliban would rein in at least the TTP, which the Taliban is not willing to do. Taliban says we can, facilitate a ceasefire, but if you think that we should get hold of them or push them out of Afghanistan, that is not going to happen. So there are tensions that are there between Pakistan and Taliban. So the hope that the Taliban would just be like Afghanistan would be a client state to Pakistan. That's absolutely not happening.
So the Duran line, of course, we know, and the Taliban of the 90s did not have the social media and the smartphone that they do today, so they're able to send a messaging. Speaking of sending a messaging, you've been very generous with your time, and for future generations coming in, either people putting on the uniform or people trying to get into the policy world or trying to understand India's military and national security, what's the words of wisdom from your many years of military service and now post-military service, where you're doing a lot of track 2 dialogues and helping shape minds of think tankers and policy watchers like myself?
So, Akshobh, not really any great sort of words of wisdom. If I could just say, my own service in the military has taught me the importance of values. And I think that's, and when I go and I talk, and sometimes in corporate world also, I say this, that look, every organization must have a sense of values, and those values must be practiced strongly. So it's not as if you just put them out. So when we talk about courage, comradeship, honesty, loyalty, honor, I mean, these are not just simple, good to have values. These are values that are absolutely indispensable for functioning of an organization. And if within your organization you can inculcate such values that become indispensable for how you work, I think that would really strengthen the organization. So that's all I'll say.
That'll be all for this episode. If you like what you're hearing, tell a friend, or 2, or 3. And if you think we've earned it, give us a good rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. So, until we meet again on The Global Detail, look after yourselves. This podcast has been a production of Karkata Media in association with Perspicacity Media LLC. All guest views are their own. If you have any questions, thoughts, or concerns, email us at globaldetailpodcast@gmail.com, or you can contact us on Facebook and Twitter at Global Detail Pod. This recording, or any portion thereof, may not be reproduced or used in any manner whatsoever without the express written permission of the publisher, except for the use of brief quotations in a review. Copyright 2023 by Karkata Media LLC. All rights reserved.